Good evening. My name is Maitri and I'm from the Ananta Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to our special program under the Ambassador Series, Partners in Sustainability, India and Denmark's Green Collaboration. This series is a unique platform for interaction with the heads of foreign missions in India and Indian missions abroad. We are honored to have with us His Excellency Rasmus Abildgaard Christensen, Ambassador of Denmark to India, for this special conversation today. A very warm welcome to you, sir. It is my pleasure to also welcome Ms. Shuva Raha, Fellow and Lead, International Cooperation, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Ms. Shuva leads CEEW's international cooperation program spanning 5 regions: Asia, Oceania, West Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, and is part of the CEO's Foresight team. Her portfolio includes energy and resource security, low carbon growth, finance, climate resilience, nexus challenges, and global governance. Ms. Shuva anchors CEEW's advisory to multilaterals like G20, Quad, BRICS, and the UN. She has been a UNFCCC COP observer since 2016 and is a Global Solutions Fellow. She engages with governments, institutions, and industry to impact sustainable development at scale, expand CEW's influence as a voice for emerging economies, and take the India story global. Ms. Shuva, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing this important conversation. It is great to have you with us. With this, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maitri, and a very warm welcome to everyone gathered over here. Thank you for coming. And of course, I have our special guest over here, His Excellency Ambassador Christensen. I had the pleasure of meeting Ambassador last week, so I'm privy to some of his views, which I'm sure he'll share with us today. But before that, a little bit of introduction to His Excellency. Ambassador Christensen has been long into this international diplomatic career. But I will, in fact, sorry to interrupt this, say that you must share with us your diversion from the diplomatic career that you told us about, a little bit on that. But he has extensive experience in overseas assignments, and he has served as in Denmark's ambassador to Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and the ASEAN. And of course, now he is here in India. A warm welcome to India, Ambassador, overall. Throughout his career, Ambassador Christensen has worked at the intersection of international cooperation, diplomacy, climate, and energy. That's an interesting experience that he brings in beyond his diplomatic acumen. He has been the head of department for green diplomacy and climate at the Danish Foreign Ministry, and he has headed the international department at the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy, and Utilities. It's timely to have him here as we embark on COP30, so we'll hear about his views on that, multilateral cooperation on green diplomacy in general, in addition to the India-Denmark bilateral cooperation on many fronts that we have. Ambassador Christensen has also been honored as the Knight of the Order of Dannebrog by Her Majesty, the Queen of Denmark in 2019. And he is here with us today. It's a privilege for us to host you, Ambassador. And we'll first listen to you, and then we have some questions for you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to join the Ananta's Ambassador series. So very pleased to be here, and very much looking forward to the discussion, not least on this the topic of today, which very much will be focusing on climate change and also, of course, the collaboration Denmark has with India in that area. And as you pointed out, we are gathered just a few days away from the COP30 in Belém in Brazil, and this will be one of the first years in a while where I will not attend a COP. I'm not sure if I will miss it. Maybe I will, but as I told others, sometimes it's when people ask me what's it like to participate in the COP, and for me it's always 3 weeks of neon light and bad coffee, but of course also something important going on. Needless to say, international climate change negotiations and the COP process are still one of the sort of key multilateral platforms we have for addressing this generational issue of climate change, and it is at a critical juncture where the multilateral system as a whole is perhaps under pressure. So maybe let me say a few words also about the sort of geopolitical situation we are facing, a little bit about the Danish cooperation with India, and then revert back to the COP process, what to expect seen from my perspective, and then we can open up the discussion. But I'll try to keep it relatively short so that we have ample time for a good discussion. Also, now that we actually have, normally we talk about roundtables, this is a round table, so let's make the best of that. But as I said in the beginning, I think, of course, important to reflect a little bit about the geopolitical moment we're in, because it does matter greatly how we navigate it if we want to deliver on the Paris Agreement and in fact also the Sustainable Development Goals. The landscape, as we all know, is really increasingly fragmented. You know, a lot of great power competition, trade disruptions, technological race also going on, including within clean tech, which is also increasingly disruptive. But at the same time, you know, our fates has never been more intertwined, and climate change does not respect borders. It cuts across, it amplifies some of the vulnerabilities we all face, whether it's flooding, energy insecurity, rising sea levels, etc. And it also, and that's perhaps important, it shapes geopolitics itself. Discussions that, at least when I started working seriously on energy-related matters and climate change, was not at the forefront, but today is at the top of the agenda, whether it's access to critical minerals, clean technology supply chains, green finance. These are not just niche topics, but are actually part and parcel of strategic political dialogues between states. And that also means that climate change itself is no longer an issue. Of course, it hasn't been for a long time, but it's really at the core of foreign policy, on security policy, and ultimately how we respond collective will not just define the planetary outcomes, that's ultimately what it's all about, but maybe also the balance of influence and to some extent the trust among states. And I think that's important to keep in mind, and maybe something we can come back to during the Q&A session. Then just a few words about the India-Denmark relationship, where I would say that in many ways, I think it's a good model for how sustainability can be woven into foreign policy. We established a Green Strategic Partnership back in 2020, and I think in many ways that's a unique flagship framework for delivering not only on climate, sustainability-related issues, but actually also on economic growth and some of the economic social priorities that both our countries have. It brings together government agencies, research institutions, and the private sector in areas such as renewable energy, water, green shipping, as well as sustainable food and agriculture and many other areas. So the name Green Strategic Partnership actually, to me at least, have real meaning. It's green because we do focus on areas, policy areas related to climate change and sustainability. It's strategic because it has real importance to our two countries and contribute to mutual strategic priorities. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the cooperation is a partnership. So we decide on the content of the programs, the things we do together, and both parties benefit from this cooperation. And then hopefully, in a wider sense, the diplomatic dimension of this, it also embodies how two, at least in this area, completely like-minded nations can turn climate ambition into a platform for strategic cooperation. Going forward, we're entering a new phase from next year where we plan to further upgrade and broaden the scope and depth of our partnership and the ambition. And that means, among other things, to expand and double down on some of the areas where the potential is still biggest. That includes energy, water, and also how to decarbonize the whole maritime industry. I think these three areas are really has extremely high potential. Then let me also go back to the COP process that I think we all reflecting on today as the COP30 starts in Belém. And to me, at least, and you know, and I think it's a real discussion that we perhaps should have about the importance and relevance of the COP process, because sometimes I have also over the years been in doubt whether it actually makes sense to fly so many people into one locality somewhere on the planet to discuss these things for a month with sometimes a limited outcome. I saw my good old friend Christina Figueres recently, expressing some doubt about the utility of keep doing it in this particular way. Bill Gates also said some things a few weeks ago that seems to indicate that he's also wondering if we are going about this in the right way. But to me, still, despite all the imperfections, it does remain as the only universal platform we have for discussing climate change, but also for keeping the Paris Agreement alive. As we all know, back in Dubai at COP28, we completed the first global stock take, and that just confirmed what we already knew and what science has long warned us, that we are off track. Global emissions continue to rise. Adaptation, including finance for it, remains insufficient, and the just transition is far from just. Let's be honest about that. That, of course, makes the COP again, the COP30 in Brazil, in Belém this month, important, and it coincides with the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, where all countries are expected to submit their enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDCs. We're still waiting for some NDCs from important countries, including India. I know it will come, so no need to criticize there. And also, and that's what we discussed before starting here. I'm of course super happy with this conversation in mind that I would not be met with embarrassing questions about what the EU is going to contribute, especially as Denmark currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Council. So the EU decided at a meeting in Brussels the day before yesterday, after long, prolonged, difficult negotiations on and that's important in itself, a 2040 target of 90% reductions related to 1990 level. I think that's really a game changer. Not easy. There were large discussions, but we can come back to it, specifically centered on to what extent climate credits could play a role or not. But we have now a 2040 target. That's not the NDC, of course, because that's related to 2035. And there we agreed on a span of 66 to 72% approximately. I think that's still a quite ambitious NDC that the EU brings to the table in Brazil, and hopefully can help increase the global ambition level. And that needs to happen, because as you probably also noticed, just a few days ago, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, and their climate center, which, by the way, happens to be located in Copenhagen, Denmark, published the annual GAP report, where I think the conclusion is that if all countries vigorously implements what they have promised in terms of NDCs, we will reach a temperature increase of somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5 degrees. If we just continue with existing policy framework, where of course a lot has happened, but then we're at 2.8 degrees. That may seem like an improvement compared to last year as a 2.8, where last year it was if I remember correctly, 3.1. So a 0.3% decrease in the expected temperature rise. But half of that decrease is simply a result of methodological changes in the way you calculate it. The rest, unfortunately, will most likely disappear when one of the very big countries in the world, when the impact of its decision no longer to be part of the Paris Agreement will kick in from next year. So basically, nothing has changed. And I think that's something, at least from a Danish and a European perspective, we need to reflect on in Belém. But looking ahead, and just to slowly wrap up, I think India's intention to host the COP33 in 2028 is, I think, a very strong signal from this country. And maybe also hopefully reflect India's growing leadership of the sort of global south in shaping the climate agenda in a good and positive way. India, of course, as we all know here, is already at the forefront and has done a lot of ambitious things, going back to COP26 when Modi announced his 5 major climate pledges. Yes, exactly. I just wasn't sure how to pronounce it, so I'm still. But including, of course, the net zero target by 2070. And I think there also just to reflect on the positive fact that, for example, if you look at the stated goal back then of achieving 50% of installed energy capacity from renewables, which should be met before 2030, it was met this year. So not just we just met it, but that just made it was just able to meet the goal. But you met it 5 years ahead of time. And I think hopefully that's something that should also demonstrate both to all skeptics around the world that, sometimes, you can actually over deliver quite easily. And it shows that scaling up renewables in a place like India is not only possible, but it goes sometimes faster than we expect. India is, of course, also pioneering a number of global coalitions. You hosted the annual assembly of the International Solar Alliance, where I attended last week. Denmark is a major contributor to the ISA, and we're happy to see all the progress that has happened in that area. And solar is a game changer. It's still now the cheapest energy source we have on the planet, and not least thanks to some of the progress that has been made in countries like India, China, and others, where it has really scaled up, and therefore prices has gone down. Just to conclude, so Denmark is very proud to be a partner in the green transition and working with India in that regard. We have this energy partnership that I think is working really well on both some more technical issues on energy planning, integration, modeling, deployment of offshore energy, but we're also looking at new areas, green hydrogen, biogas, energy efficiency, etc. But because the climate challenge is, the biggest test, if you like, of human solidarity that we have, the response also has to be collective and match that challenge. And hopefully, the relationship or the cooperation Denmark and India at least has in that matter shows that it can be done, not just on a technical bilateral level, but also at the COPs and other places, and hopefully inspires others to do the same. So with those words, happy to discuss, take questions. There's a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So before we start, I just want to say that none of these questions are scripted. Ambassador doesn't know what I'm going to ask. I also did not know what he was going to say. So it's actually an open forum. And we will have audience questions. So please keep your questions ready. And they should be short and pointed so we cover a lot of ground. But let me start from COP since it's immediate and the flavor of the day. So one of the things about COP, Ambassador, is that the NDCs are lesser than what many countries are doing by themselves, right? So because there's a negotiation component to it. And as you said, India has reached 50%, but we also reached the original NDC of 40% in 2021, right? And one of the interesting things, I don't know if everybody knows, I'll share with them, that India's 50% or 40% is particularly important because the total quantity keeps increasing. So the share is a rolling achievement. So we are maintaining and increasing pace of decarbonizing the power sector. But my question to you is, we'll have a lot of headlines right now. I mean, India, we don't know exactly to the extent of which we'll commit, but a lot of countries will come under fire. We've done a study at CEW that shows that outside the negotiations, the many announcements that happen, only 5% of that eventually reach the goal that they're stated to during COP. So in this negotiation and NDC's headlines, the initiatives headlines, the actual target, do you think we're missing the point that countries within themselves are moving and those stories are not coming out adequately? What are your thoughts on that?
It's actually a good question, and I think there are probably two aspects here. I think to start with the first, where India is, and it's not meant as a criticism, but I think it is interesting that we see a lot of commitments being made in the climate change negotiations in terms of the NDCs that are perhaps too conservative, in the sense that India has now already met a couple of its targets years ahead of time. And India is not the only country. The same applies to China and in fact also to others. So that shows that perhaps some of the policymakers are a little too cautious in what they are willing to commit to. And of course, I can understand that whether it's China or India or the European Union and others, you don't want to commit to more than you feel confident that you can actually deliver on. But it still seems that people are a little too overcautious. And just to remind everybody about the let's say the architecture or of the Paris Agreement, how it actually works, and how it was changed. Because as you may remember, when the COP 15 took place in Copenhagen in 2009, which was a total failure. So happy to admit that. I'm sure we are partly to blame, but as the hosts, but of course, it ultimately reflected that first of all that the world was not ready to agree on what we were later able to agree on in Paris. But it also reflected that the approach was probably not right, because in Copenhagen the whole idea was to say, okay, we need to, make these globally. We need to achieve these emissions reductions, and then sort of allocate responsibility accordingly. Okay, if this is where we have to be, then you have to reduce this much, you have to reduce that much. And of course, nobody could agree on that, and the whole thing collapsed. Then it was turned around with the Copenhagen Accord, which is what came out of it, and was at the time lauded as a huge disappointment, but was actually the building block for what later made the Paris Agreement possible, which is to completely turn it around and say, okay, now we will ask countries what they are willing to commit to. And of course, what countries would then commit to would in no way meet what was necessary. But, and this is here where the Paris Agreement, I still think, has the beauty of it, which is the so-called ambition mechanism. Namely that we have this global stock takes where every 5 years, countries have to go back, revise their commitments, and then enhance them, so become more ambitious. And the whole idea was, which was actually, I think in many ways clever, that maybe it would be better, instead of solving it once and for all, that as technology develops, as the cost of the transition comes down, as we become wiser, as we see what other countries are doing, the countries would be gradually more comfortable committing to more as time goes. So that's the ambition mechanism, right? And I think it's partly working. But, to answer your question then, maybe it's not 100% working, because there still seems to be some let's say, some cautiousness in the system, where, again, the fact that India has met some of these targets, again, for example, the renewable energy target 5 years ahead of time, actually in many ways illustrates what this ambition mechanism is there for, namely that maybe then you could be more comfortable with an even more ambitious commitment next year. So I think that's one aspect, and hopefully that can be dealt with. The second part, which I think maybe also should be addressed, is that at a COP, there's also a lot of other commitments being made from the private sector, from philanthropies, from government, whatever, that is not technically part of the NDC. And I'm pretty confident a lot of that is also, if you start tracking it, I'd also be curious to know what actually comes out of it 5 years later. And so, whether I'm not saying it's all greenwashing, but there are a lot of things being mentioned and made, numbers being thrown out there, and it's probably not all that stands up to scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, there's some amount of headline management, but what I do agree, and because I think, like Ambassador, I've also worked in an era where climate change was not synonymous in every conversation, which it has become now. So part of the COP process's success has been making the climate conversation mainstream and putting some numbers to it, because then it's easy to track. But at the same time, if I sort of look at the pure negotiations process, then the actual stories of these countries, which is the core of the nationally determined contribution to the negotiation, but contribution from your country, I think there is a gap in how well we are capturing that. And if we capture that well, then maybe the metrics of the temperature gap itself might be less if we take the actual gains rather than committed gains into measurement.
No, I fully agree. And I also still think that, to some extent, having spent so much time at COPs, is that sometimes it's also a bit of a bubble with people who have been revolving in this circuit as negotiators for many, many years, whereas in many of those countries, actually, industry is far ahead. In other sectors, things are actually going pretty fast. And I'm not sure at the national level in a lot of countries that this link is really being made to the extent it should.
That brings me to the question I want to ask you. You worked in industry for a little while, and so you've experienced this sort of gap between policy making and the understanding and how industry thinks. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yes, just to elaborate, having quickly on in terms of my career, I've spent more than 20 years in diplomacy, and a lot of it actually in what you could call international climate or energy diplomacy. But before coming here, I spent some years in the private sector working for Denmark's one of Denmark's large clean tech companies, where I also got an opportunity to meet a lot of other companies, and in general, just spent a lot more time with private sector players. And actually, in many ways, it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot, but it also gave rise to much more optimism than I actually had before that experience. In the sense that at least now I'm fully convinced, and I'll not be ashamed of saying that what's gonna save us is the private sector. I'm sorry, that's simply where we are. It's technology, it's a market. Those two forces are what ultimately is gonna make this happen. And if you really see and understand what's going on at that level around the world, it's actually pretty impressive, and there's a lot going on, and it's going also much faster than we've thought just a few years ago, despite a backlash some places here or there, whatever. But still, the trajectory I think is pretty clear. Of course, the main problem is still that if you just look at that, we will decarbonize, absolutely. But of course, will we do it in time? Is it fast enough? That's another matter. But anyway, back to the private sector. I think part of the problem here is, despite all the many discussions, it's my impression that policymakers are still not fully aware or fully understands what the technology can do. Doesn't always understand where the cutting edge of the technology is. People say, "Oh, we cannot do this," but you can. The technology is already there. And therefore also as regulators, how do you regulate in a way that would help to unlock this technology that we already have at our disposal, or help finance it, help scale it up? I mean, I think that's a challenge. And I was surprised that even in my country, which I honestly thought that this link would have been easier and better, you still sometimes faced a bit of a wall when I went to the other side of the table and suddenly represented a private company, and I was met with an enormous suspicion from the system. That when I came to say something, I thought I was going to sell something to them. No, I'm just trying to explain to you that you can actually do this today from a technological perspective, and then up to you what you want to do with it. But we just wanted to let you know. But a huge skepticism from the policymakers towards the private sector. They saw it as dirty lobbying, but hey, that's not the point. The point is we need to talk, because otherwise you as policymakers do not understand what the technology can do.
So one of the pillars of the India-Denmark relationship is related to this technology co-development, IPRs. Now, IPR is a sensitive area, right? The intellectual property, and a lot of the tech transfers, tech collaborations are not happening because of this IPR issue. Do you have any experience with that? Do you want on how, especially if you say a developing country and a developed country starts working where the relationship is unequal to begin with, how do you negotiate such things?
Yeah, that's of course sometimes a difficult issue, and you do have Western Danish companies who would have concerns about moving activities, investing in other countries because of IPR concerns. So and I don't think the solution to that is to say that they should not worry about it, or that they should not protect their IPR, because otherwise no development would happen if people just sort of steal it, so to speak. But I think it also underestimates. It's also a discussion that distracts a little bit from what's actually going on, which is that there's actually a lot of co-creation, co-development, joint research going on, and just looking at what we're doing here in India, we're doing a lot of joint research activities where we sponsor, for example, the joint calls between the Danish Ministry of Science and the Danish Innovation Fund, together with the Department of Science and Technology, Department of Biotechnology, on clean hydrogen, on water, and so on. So these are researchers coming together, often also with private companies, so doing things together. So there's no, in today's globalized world, again, from a private sector perspective, then it's just that, okay, we have Danish entities together with Indian entities taking up the IPR together and form a partnership. That's perfectly possible. But of course, the requirement, and that's where we can help, is to ensure that all countries who want to be part of this game has a well-developed IPR system. So then it's more a question of then who registers it together. But if you don't have it, then of course the concern is not so much that a Danish company is working with an Indian company. It is that there's a third company over here who suddenly comes in and steals it. That you don't want, right?
Right.
No, and then I'll just very quickly say we actually also have a very good cooperation with India on IPR. So we also contribute in that way with a focus on especially some of the clean technologies plus healthcare.
So that's important because that brings me to, the intention behind the India-Denmark strategic partnership, which is anchored in ecosystem development rather than stop and start or project level interventions only. And a couple of the things that we see, you mentioned water, food, health, sort of this nexus challenges. In India, a lot of this is, modern research on this is fairly nascent still. Our administration of these things are siloed. The ministries, we have started very early baby steps of unifying all this. How has Denmark unified its work on this? What can we learn from that? That is my one question. A second question related to ecosystem development would be, one of the recommendations that I had made when I wrote on the India-EU cooperation was how historic cities, because Europe has historic cities and so does India, and these are very difficult to transform entirely without losing their historic character. And we have Udaipur and Aarhus, they're partner cities, and both, of course, are very, very old historic cities. Here, if you look at municipal services of water or food distribution or mobility, etc., this we think is a very important area where we can have cooperation with many European cities. What are your thoughts on both of these things?
Yeah, that's two very big questions. First, on the nexus question, I think of course that's an issue here. I like that things are approached sometimes in a compartmentalized or siloed way, but that's also the case in my country. So we have been struggling also to connect the dots. Of course, it's slowly happening where people start understanding that some of our water challenges is ultimately also about energy, and vice versa. And I think the best way to go about that is sometimes to demonstrate it in practice, what can be done. An example of that could be, where water meets energy, for example, here is some of the work we do on wastewater treatment plants. I think what people may not realize is that if you sit in a municipal administration and you look at and that doesn't matter whether you're in India or in Denmark, and you look at your electricity bill, then it's actually not schools or hospitals or whatever government or municipal building that you own that pops up as the main consumer. So the top consumer would be wastewater treatment plants. They eat up an enormous amount of electricity. And we have actually, over the years, worked on that in Denmark to make them more energy efficient, even energy neutral. And more recently, most of our new plants are energy positive, where we have managed to bring down the consumption to a very, very low level. And then on top of that, we can make biogas from the sludge or use heat pumps to utilize the small temperature differences in the chemical processes or the biological processes and harvest that. So that's really the future. And most of these technologies are low-hanging fruits, I would say, in a sense that they have short payback times. But it takes a huge burden off the municipal budgets, because now suddenly they don't need to spend all that money on electricity and can use it on something else. And I think, at least I've experienced it in India, that resonates quite well with some of the states where this is such a big part of their budget is simply dishing out electricity. And India is also a country that needs that electricity for other things. So I think a good example of where I think over time, as we work together, this nexus thing will gain to the forefront. The city question. So, and I'm not entirely sure what the precise question was here, but
How do you redesign historic cities
Right.
for modern use?
Yes.
Or even future friendly?
Yeah.
Forget modern.
Yeah. No, so maybe two reflections on that, on how to redesign historic cities. And I think, at least in the Nordic countries, and I'm looking at my Finnish colleague here, who I'm sure could tell a completely similar story from Helsinki or whether it's in Copenhagen. That is, of course, an important matter. But I think a couple of things we learned. And first of all, to start there, I think it's also important to recognize that the Danish, and I'm sure the Finnish or other European cities as well, if you go back to the 1960s, 70s, they were terribly polluted. Copenhagen in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, nobody would consider taking a swim in the harbor. Or the city where I studied, Aarhus, the second biggest city in Denmark, we had a river. It was so polluted from industrial waste and other things that the municipal government decided to simply cover it with asphalt and then make a road over this river because it smelled so much and it was nasty. And then of course over time we have worked we managed to actually work on this. So it's never too late in a sense, and we have now cleaned it up. So the river in Aarhus where I studied has now been, the asphalt has been removed. The river is back to its original flow. The water is treated, and now a whole ecosystem of restaurants and has sprung up along the side of the river, and people are enjoying it. So I think that's one aspect of how you approach the historical part. I think the other part where maybe a little bit to the nexus thing again, where various things intersect, is that in Denmark, at least for the past couple of years, we have talked a lot about buildings, construction, and how carbon relates to that. I mean, how to decarbonize our buildings. It's still that 40% of our emissions somehow relate to buildings, and there are different components of this. First generation is all about, remember to switch off the lights when you leave a room. This is the basic stuff, right? But of course, it's moved on to a lot more to embedded carbon. So basically, the carbon it takes to produce building materials. And of course, there we realize that renovation of existing buildings is not only cheaper, but it's from a carbon perspective much better than building a lot of new stuff. So therefore, preserving what is there is always better. And then at the same time, you preserve the historical heritage. So you can actually do that, also both in a cost-efficient manner, but also something that is carbon efficient, if you like. And then finally, but that's more of a sidetrack, I think the frontier of that, which is the case both in Finland and Denmark, for example, is now we also start talking about the building process. So not just the embedded carbon or the energy that the buildings use, but the carbon that was emitted during the process of building the houses. So that's from excavators or the process related element. And surprisingly, when you start looking at it, it's a very big part of the carbon that goes into buildings is at the very construction phase. So electrifying machinery, all these things is a way forward. Then finally, back to the historic part, I think if you turn more to the climate and not so much the carbon, but the climate impact side, so the adaptation part, which will be costly. I think for all European cities, the city of Copenhagen, for example, is spending a lot of money on preparing for what we know will come, and not just in 50 years. It's already here, and just in a few years it will get even worse. Copenhagen is close to the sea, so that's one thing that has to be dealt with. Dikes has to be elevated and so forth. But more importantly, perhaps is a more unstable or increased precipitation, basically flash floods. So how do we deal with that? So what I mentioned before about the harbor now being cleaned up, so people today are swimming and enjoying it, but that's only possible because the sewage and the rainwater is separated. But what happens during a flash flood is that you cannot control it, and the two things gets mixed up, and then you have sewage water spilling into the harbor, and then you're back to square one. So how to solve that? So what the city found out was that it took, you can see it today if you walk around in Copenhagen, many of the parks has been turned into gigantic reservoirs, but in a way where you hardly notice it unless you know what to look for. So many of the parks would have a little bit of you walk down, perhaps even less than this, less than a meter here you see from floor up to but maybe something like that. So you kind of at the edge of the park you walk down a little bit, and then you are actually in a park. It looks completely like the park did before, but it can be turned, if necessary, into a gigantic reservoir where for a short period of time you can divert water so that the wastewater treatment plants would have time to cope with it. So these kind of improvements are being made to make sure, again, you don't disturb the historical heritage, but also are able to adapt to the climate changes that will come.
Thank you for that, Braden. But as you can see, a lot of activity areas are emerging for us for your next 4 years that we have to do. I have to go to the audience also. I'm sure they have lots of questions, but I want to ask you two quick questions. You touched upon maritime industry. That's again something in India. We just had the Maritime Invest in Mumbai last week, but it's again something that is not mainstream in terms of research, action, etc. What are your plans to sort of bring Denmark's expertise to India, where we can socialize this? And my second question to you would be your comments for the youth. I have a lot of young colleagues here. They are a little disillusioned with the way things are going with the climate and the world in general. Little bit of thoughts for them. But because I don't want to directly ask you a question on about the tech race or the resource race, because we keep talking about that. But what's the good part of that?
Yeah, maritime first. Yeah, as you say, India hosted the India Maritime Week in Mumbai 2 weeks ago, and I think it was a spectacular success. Certainly, we have excellent cooperation with India within maritime affairs, and it's focused very much on green shipping or decarbonizing the maritime industry. Because despite and that's another long sidetrack, but we can come back to it if people are interested, a little bit of a setback in London 2 weeks ago when the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, was about to agree on basically uniform rules on how to decarbonize shipping. The decision was postponed for a year, but I think that the movement is still very much there, and it will come. Denmark is a very big shipping nation. We are home to the world's second largest shipping company, and we have many other shipping companies, and they wish, especially the big ones, to be front runners in this area. Shipping still accounts, especially ocean-going shipping, for a very large percentage of global emissions. It needs to be decarbonized, but it's also one of the hard-to-abate sectors in the sense that it's not easy. You cannot electrify a container ship, unfortunately. At least not as it looks now. That will require some amazing batteries, but they cannot be done. So you need to look in other directions. So basically, the solution here is some sort of clean fuel, and there I think India has quite an opportunity because the problem right now is that even for the big shipping companies who are not just future off-takers, a company like Maersk, the Danish shipping company, has already 20 methanol ships in the pipeline. Most of them has already been delivered. But as this will cover the whole industry, the problem is that there's not enough supply of fuel. The methanol, the hydrogen, the ammonia, it's not produced in enough quantity to merit further investment. So we end up basically with a chicken and egg discussion. So I think the message from them to the Indian government, for example, is that you can safely invest in this because we will be a major off-taker. And they are trying to reassure the world by ordering new ships, and in that sense, they are taking a huge leap of faith, because if it doesn't pull out, they are stuck with ships that has nothing to sail on, right? So that's where we are. But for India, first of all, the production of clean fuels, I think, will be a huge opportunity. Then the second part that's related to it is also then to be the center of a number of green corridors, shipping maritime corridors around the world. There, that we are working with the Ministry of Port and Shipping on developing these green corridors using a sort of internationally recognized methodology for how you do that, so that you tap into the global ecosystem of those who want to be front movers on green shipping corridors. Number two. Then shipbuilding. As you probably know, the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi has some very ambitious plans for India to become a new hub for shipbuilding. I think that's a laudable ambition, and it will happen. And again, some of the customers will most likely be Danish companies for these ships. I think the key point here, this is more a personal reflection, and for India and the Indian shipyards to consider, is maybe to copy a little bit what China did with the electric vehicles. So instead of trying to outsmart the Koreans in making diesel-fueled container ships, why not go directly to become experts in the clean in ships running on clean fuels, and it's not just the propulsion system and the fact that you sail on clean fuels. A clean ship would also be a very energy efficient ship, where you use all kinds of technologies to make a ship more energy efficient, from using the right paint to various other technologies. You've probably also seen some futuristic where they combine fuel with sails and all kinds of things. So there's so much you can do. So I think as India will now grow its shipping industry, maybe a good idea to actually become a real global first mover in the green ships, instead of trying trying to copy old Japanese, Korean technology that will be outdated anyway. But that's more of a personal suggestion. But I think it's entirely it's a business opportunity, and see it that way. Yeah. What was the other question? Youth, yes. What's the message to the youth? Yeah, that's difficult. But again, ultimately, it may seem that we are getting nowhere, and I think it's easy to understand that you can get very frustrated and think that neither the COP nor anything else delivers. But again, I think my experience from the private sector is that there's a lot actually going on the ground, and then maybe for those, consider maybe actually a career in the private sector, but in a company that actually works in this area. That's probably where you can make the biggest difference. But that being said, we still need the voices of the youth, whether it's on the streets or in politics and policy, as well as in the private sector. We need it all to make this happen, because I think, as we all know, as Obama said, this is the young people, this is the first generation that will feel the impact, but they're also the last that can do anything about it.
All right. I don't know if there are mics there, but questions? You'll have to put your hand up so I can just... Are there mics there? Any questions? Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you for your discussion. I'm really interested, and also I'm interested in CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So, if I may ask, I want to ask two questions about your insights or opinions. I think CBAM in India is the biggest one of the countries who will receive negative impacts the most. But at the same time, and many people criticize CBAM as kind of trade barrier. But at the same time, CBAM can be really great opportunity to increase decarbonization policies. So one question is from your perspective, what would be the how can exporting countries like India better align with CBAM? Kind of use CBAM as opportunity. How can better align with CBAM? And second question is there any collaboration opportunities between India, exporting countries like India and European countries like Denmark? So if you have any thoughts about those things, I want to ask.
CBAM. But yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to reiterate what the purpose is of CBAM, and then I'll be happy to discuss, because I fully agree, but also from a personal perspective, it's not a perfect system, and there are all kinds of problems with it. But the principle is what I'm now trying to explain, which ultimately has to do with the carbon leakage, right? So the EU has now, after years of trial and error, a well-functioning emissions trading scheme, and we in Europe have a price on carbon, right? So the problem with that, however, is that if the rest of the world doesn't, then a number of our industries will simply just move. So that's the whole point of carbon leakage, right? Why would you have a steel plant or any other hard-to-abate industry? Cement, we have a cement plant in Denmark. If it was to pay the carbon prices that we now have in Europe, and of course the reason, just to make that clear, for having a price on carbon is this is the only thing that really works in order to get industry to look into new technologies and decarbonize. And I think the emissions trading system as a whole for European industry has actually worked remarkably well. So it's a strong market-driven incentive. Instead of regulating and setting standards for this and this and this, just let the market deal with it. There is a price on carbon. If you emit carbon, it's more expensive than if you don't. Hence, you create a strong incentive to decarbonize, and that has worked well. But when it comes particularly to the hard-to-abate sectors, it's very clear that if we had such a price on carbon where the technological improvements will take more time and it's difficult to make, then these companies would just disappear. And then it becomes a question of industrial policy and whether we can sort of accept that in Europe, that all our steel plants, cement plants, other heavy industries will simply pack up and go. So the way to avoid that is then CBAM, namely that if you want to export goods cement, steel, these kind of heavy industry products into Europe, then you would be met with a similar carbon price as what the European companies are facing in Europe, because otherwise you are not competing on equal terms. So that's the principle behind it. And to be honest, I think that's a fair principle. Because I mean, from a climate perspective, and it doesn't target any particular country. It just says that this is Europe and those who are not part of it. Now, how to deal with it then, and that is also very clear that if the exporting country has its own carbon trading system or price on carbon, then you're exempt. And there are some regulations for that. And a number of countries are now, I think, for that reason, starting to work on carbon pricing. And I honestly think that some countries, I will not mention them, but around the world, I mean, not talking about India here, but others, their work on carbon pricing would not have happened, and emissions trading would not have happened if it wasn't for CBAM. So because they know that they would otherwise be cut off from the European market. So in that sense, it's had a strong incentive in that we all try to put a price on carbon. Now, that being said, as always, these things are not perfect. There's a lot of things related to the administration of CBAM that is a little challenging, also for European industry. And I think the Commission and Parliament agreed over the summer on a sort of a simplification package, which especially means that all small, medium-sized enterprises importing, for example, would be exempt. And that means that a lot of what it is, like steel, for example, if it goes to a small, medium-sized company in Europe, then you don't need to fill out all these complicated forms and so on, because that would actually then end up being a trade barrier more than solve the environmental problem. But otherwise, the principle stands, and therefore the way forward, and that's then another discussion on. I think this is a personal reflection, but I honestly think then it's also an obligation for us in Europe to use some of the proceeds to help other countries then implement carbon pricing, and so that we all get to that level, because that's the only way forward.
Okay. More questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Shubhan. Thank you, Ambassador, for inviting. I'm Pinaki. I'm from the Associate Chambers of Commerce and Industry of India. But my question is not from industry, because we keep on hearing the narratives. My question is about how in Denmark and in Europe, people are perceiving climate change, and how are you taking the pressure of people to the parliament? Is that a real thing? I'm talking about an average household. Like when we go back to our home and I try to explain climate change to my siblings and to parents, it's very challenging, isn't it? But what is the situation there, especially with the education, with your homes? Thank you.
Yeah. I think back in 2009, we had a parliamentary election in Denmark. The key topic was climate change. So the election was decided on the issue of climate change. Those parties who wanted to have a strong progressive position on climate change were rewarded. Those who didn't were punished. So that, to me, that shows that that is probably the first time in a national election that climate change was the main topic. I think now we are facing a small backlash for all kinds of reasons, and we can discuss that. But ultimately, I think the average voter, climate change has gone from a negligible position way down the agenda to becoming at least one of the key topics. Of course, other issues now are perhaps even more important for the average European voter, but it's still an important issue. And then I think if you then do surveys, which is certainly done in Denmark on a more generational aspect, then you can see that if you ask young people, what is the most important, and this is still today, 2025, what in Denmark at least, what would you consider the most important political issue to be dealt with, then climate change comes out as number one. Number two is something about is healthcare. Number three is like youth well-being, those are the top three topics for young people. If you ask the generation who is, let's say, over 50 or even over 60, it's completely different. Then climate change is much further down the agenda. It's not towards the bottom, but it's maybe 4 or 5. It's not number 1, and then it's healthcare is 1, and something like that. So I think, and I think actually I've seen statistics showing that you see the same pattern in most other countries around the world, and not just in developed countries. I think that's important to keep in mind. I know that of course many places you have more urgent priorities, as young person, jobs, education, and so on. But still, despite some of these, which must, the kind of pressures that maybe a Danish young person is not facing, still climate change is high on the agenda. So I also have hopes that there is some generational thing going on here that hopefully will carry this into politics. Yeah.
We're at 5 minutes, but I'll take 5 minutes. I actually want to ask you, you think when this youth become a little older, their pride is a rolling target?
We say time will tell.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll ask one final closing question to you. You've been to a lot of Asian countries, from Indonesia, Timor-Leste. You've been a part of the ASEAN. Now you're in India. What do you expect? How are you feeling right now? How do you see this geography playing out over the next 5 years, next 20 years?
Well, this geography is where the battle will be decided. I think that's very clear. If you look at all statistics, whether it's coal consumption or energy consumption or whatever, it's about Asia. Is Asia gonna do it right or not? Will decide the fate of the planet. It's actually not what the Americans are doing, despite you might think so, or the Europeans for that matter. But it's what happens here in Asia, and there I think if you then dig a little deeper, then it becomes interesting, right? Because the problems are massive in many ways, right? Again, looking at the coal consumption, the future challenges are also massive in the sense that it's still a region that grows enormously economically, and therefore it's not just about the power systems like in Europe we have now and how do we decarbonize them. It's as much about the capacity we are going to build in the years to come. What would that look like? So there are some massive challenges, but at the same time, Asia is also very much at the forefront. I mean, India is already a world leader in solar. The amount of solar you have deployed here is breathtaking. China, it goes without saying, is already controlling or leading many of these clean technology areas, but also others like Japan, Korea, and so on. So in general, a lot of the technological progress also comes out of this region. So you kind of have both the sort of things going on at the same time, and I think for the rest of us in Europe, it's all about just helping, supporting, and being part of a positive agenda here, because this is where we will see whether we make it or not.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being in the hot seat, for taking all questions, for your great depth of explanation of some unusual areas. Yes, I mean, I think, yes, like, for instance, maritime, what can we do further? And I think your work is cut out in the Trade Department, working with us. So thank you very much. Welcome to India. We hope to see you around. We'll maybe do a stock take after COP stock take. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been interesting. I hope you had as much fun listening to Ambassador Christensen as I did. So a big hand for him, please. Thank you very much. And over to you, Maitri, to close. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Richa. I will be another center. Maitri had to step out.
Okay.
But thank you so much,
So
Ambassador. Thank you, Shubha.
All right, thank you.
I'm sure we'll see you for a future.
Thank you.
Thank you.